All right. Thank you so much for coming to our session. You are in reference letter writing, writing about the individual. My name is Brenna Matlock, and I'm the Senior Project Manager at JMU Center for International Stabilization and Recovery. And I'm joined today with Cassidy Persson of the University Career Center. Cassidy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Cassidy Persson, and I am a career advisor and the liaison to the College of Health and Behavioral Studies at JMU's University Career Center.
And we were very excited to have about 40 people register for this session. And to us, it demonstrates that each of you really care about the quality of your letters and the impacts that they make on your students and coworkers. Cassidy and I were inspired to do this research, create this presentation as we discussed our own experiences writing and reading letters of recommendation. And it's a process we all realized that we learned informally. So I think it's something we should talk about more. I also want to take a moment to shout out Lindsay Aldrich of the Center for Global Engagement. She had some input on many aspects of this presentation. So thank you so much, Lindsay. So a couple of housekeeping items before we dive in. We also want to say that we are not the end all be all on this topic. Cassidy and I realize that we are both white cis women, and therefore our observations and perspectives will be shaped by who we are, and we recognize that different people will have vastly different experiences. We hope that this participants will share their opinions and experiences during the section, and I think we should all leave here more thoughtful and with more ideas about how to go about the important task of writing letters of recommendation. Please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. We'll pause for questions and comments throughout, and you're also welcome to use the chat function at any time. This session will be recorded. We had a few people who can't join us live, so we are just saving it for them. And then the live transcript is available at the bottom of your screen. So as a reminder, these are the objectives for the session. We want to think critically about how participants write about others, particularly as it relates to gender, race, and disability when providing a professional reference. We want to introduce examples of implicit bias, the latest research findings, and best practices for writing letters of recommendation. We also want to share our practice experiences in our own writing and develop ways to start further conversations about diversity and reference letters. So let's dive in. We wanted to start with a temperature check. So we've created a poll that I will start now. So we'd like you to answer the question, have you ever written a letter of recommendation before? It looks kind of, so 90% of us have written letters, about 10% have not. I think that's interesting just because in my own experience, it was just for many years of my professional experience, I wasn't writing letters of recommendation. And just in the past 2 years, I think it's just really picked up that I've been writing reference letters. It's almost like it happened all of a sudden based on how my role changed. And it was just happening. So does anyone want to comment on when they started or how they learned to write letters of recommendation? You're welcome to use the chat box. So yeah, Joy, I Googled to find examples. Yeah, I certainly, when I was writing letters of recommendations, I would think of ones that I have read in the past and felt that they had a good structure. I've definitely Googled things. Reading letters is helpful. Lindsay started supervising students. It happened all of a sudden. Using templates online. Meredith, when she started as a teaching fellow. Sharing websites. Using someone else's letter as a template. See what others and your colleagues have written. In Virginia, you worked in admissions and had to read many before you started writing them. Yeah, that was my experience. I read way more than I wrote. Research online and templates. So very similar experiences, it looks like. So I want to ask another question in the chat box. So how do you think recommendation letters transform or impact our communities? And that's the topic of the day. Coming into this session, what did you think about that? How letters impact our communities and impact others? They illustrate what is valued, definitely. Recommendation letters are influential. They set applicants apart. They can play a very important role in the hiring process, yeah. provide insight about the person you're writing it for, anecdotal evidence. Big difference for the community opportunities are offered to people. Used to only think about the individual quest, but now reading more and recruiting more, realize the greater impact they have. Meredith, as the JMU Student Fellowships Advisor, I see letters of recommendations as oftentimes the key to opening new doors for students. I agree. Great, thank you all so much for your comments. So allow me to be a nerd for a moment and dive into some theory and concepts that I think are really interesting around this issue. And we'll define some terms that we'll bring up during this session. I think one thing we can see from our discussion before in the last slide is that letters of recommendations and the roles of recommender and recommendees is that there is a power dynamic at play. When I talk about power, I often think about the way it's framed by a queer philosopher and writer, Michel Foucault. Foucault wrote that power is an everyday social phenomenon. He views it as something that's often invisible or subtle because it's unnoticed. Writing a letter of recommendation is kind of an everyday thing. By reframing our perspectives, we can create change. We need to know what the power relationship is. What are the power dynamics from writing letters of reference? For example, students may feel nervous and have a lack of knowledge about the process. They're putting trust in you for the letter, and you are using your influence to create change in your community. You're opening those doors for students. The trouble we may encounter when wanting to use this power and transform our communities is the issues of implicit bias. Many of you may be familiar with the concept. There have been some really great sessions earlier this week about implicit bias, but as a refresher, I'll read a short excerpt from an article, Responsibility for Implicit Bias. So implicit biases are typically characterized as automatic associations of which we are not aware, that are difficult to control and may conflict with our professional beliefs and values. Although implicit processes are pervasive, unavoidable, and often useful aspects of our cognitions, they may also lead us into error. The most problematic forms of implicit cognition are those which target social groups, encode stereotypes, or reflect prejudicial evaluation hierarchies. Despite intentions to the contrary, these biases can influence our behaviors and judgments, contributing to patterns of discriminatory behavior. So it's always our intention writing a letter of recommendation. We want our students to succeed. We want our coworkers to succeed, but there may be implicit biases at play that may affect our letters. I also wanted to show pictured here is Mazrin Rustem Banaji. She's an American psychologist at Harvard University, and she is known for popularizing this term of implicit bias. Lastly, I wanted to introduce the idea of genre theory. So in genre theory, it's that technical documents like recommendation letters are shaped by an invisible process created by repetitive social action. The document is shaped by its form, content, and audience. We can also think critically not only about our word choice and implicit biases, but examine the document itself. We are critical of the document's purpose and what it's trying to achieve. Perhaps the structure and influences shaping recommendation letters themselves, the hiring process, is an avenue to better understanding the connection between these letters and diversity outcomes. So we're going to jump into problems letter writers may run into, but first we need to acknowledge there's a significant lack in the following categories: research related to reference letter writing and race, disability, and the LGBTQIA+ community. While the gendered experience is well understood, we need more information as a whole. If you know any articles or research, if this is something that interests you and you've come across it, we'd love to hear about it. If you want to share it in the chat, just add to our research that we're collecting around this issue. So we do know a lot about implicit biases and differences based on gender, and these could potentially be applied to other groups, but it's not as studied. So as we did our research, we found out some differences based on gender when it came to letter writing, things that people may not be aware of. For example, letters about women include more doubt-raising phrases than those about men, and that even one such phrase can be a difference in a job search. So for example, A doubt raiser may be something as she might be good. Um, there might be faint praises such as she'll do okay. And sometimes this information becomes a red flag for readers. And so we should think about why we are including doubt raisers in our letters. Letters written about women are typically shorter and likely to lack basic features, such as how they knew the applicant, concrete references about the applicant's record, or evaluative statements about the applicant's traits or accomplishments. Letters about men are more likely to emphasize accomplishments, for example, his research, his skills, or his career, while letters about women are 50% more likely to include grindstone adjectives. So a grindstone adjective, for example, would be hardworking, committed, but not necessarily saying much about their ability. In addition to being shorter, so then we do have some information for persons of color when they are written about in letters of recommendation. Letters for persons of color are less likely to give ringing endorsements and only include minimal assurance, such as they can do the job, or a veiled praise rather than a ringing endorsement. So a veiled praise would be example, surprisingly sharp. That's something we don't want to include in our letters. And so we can also think about the kind of details that we include in our letters, the adjectives that we use. Are we talking about the person's appearance? Often we only get about a page or two to talk about this person. So what are the most key things that we need to include, and think about why it is that we include those details. I'm going to check the chat if there are any questions so far. Any comments? Now in the frame of mind to watch out for implicit biases and write a letter of recommendation that writes about the individual thoughtfully. Often letters can fill in the gaps. That's what someone was saying, anecdotal evidence or describing that person in a way that their other documents might not when they're applying. So those can be, fill in the gaps for things such as GPA, number of extracurricular, things like that. Something about someone's identity may be an important part of their story and demonstrate why they would succeed. However, we do need to keep in mind the kinds of information that we share. So this slide is actually from a presentation by Dr. Melbourne Wade. She's here today. Thank you for joining us, Meredith. And she is the Director of Student Fellowship Advising in the Research and Scholarship Department. In January, she offered a best practices for recommendation letters. That was super helpful, and I highly recommend it if she offers it again in the near future. So these were her recommendations for when you include personal data about others. So only when it's relevant, as little as possible, and with permission. Permission is very important when discussing these kinds of details. Does this information show us something no other data will? Is it relevant to the program, school, or award? How little can I say about it while still getting my point across? Is the student comfortable with this disclosure? And in terms of race, class, sexual orientation, first generation status, disability, and family history, what does the student want to share? These are all really important. And so if you're really interested on what to include in letters, and you want to continue learning, I definitely would recommend Meredith as a resource. She gave a lot of really good examples about this during her presentation. So I'm sure she could fill in more information about that. All right, now for the second part of our presentation, I spoke a lot about theory and what the current research is. And so I'm going to hand it over to Cassidy for the second half of this session to discuss possible tricky scenarios, best practices, and letter writing tools. Over to you, Cassidy.
All right, thank you, Brenna. So I'm going to put an example recommendation letter for you all in the chat in just a moment. I encourage you to take a few moments just to read it over and ask yourself some of the questions here. So do you see any examples of the features that we've mentioned so far, like the veiled praises, the doubt raisers? Who does this letter seem written for? You'll notice on the letter that I have the pronouns and any identifiers blacked out. And how can you tell, and could it be written for anyone? So I'm going to plop this in the chat, and then just let me know if you can't access it or you need a different version. comment. Bored in English class seems like veiled praise. Okay. Okay, there are concrete examples of accomplishments. Okay. Meredith guesses this would be for a female student. Okay. For a graduate school letter, I would expect a deeper dive into the student scholarship. That's totally fair. Okay, surprise street about an instructor talking about the person's church and multiple community projects didn't seem relevant coming from the instructor. Yeah, for sure. That's a good point. I was thinking about that as well. And it could be that maybe the student had these things on their resume. Unsure. Okay, written for a female student. The phrase special demeanor raises concerns. Yes, caring, warm demeanor seems to be for female. Potential for great things, veiled praise. Awesome. You all are picking up on all the features we discussed. It's great. Absolutely. Yeah, these are all great comments. So there's nothing about interpersonal skills. Absolutely. So this letter was indeed written for a female. So you all picked up, I think, on um, the caring, warm demeanor, kind of a little bit of veiled praise. Yeah, everything that I was going to mention, you all picked up on. So that's great. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about some best practices for how to write a letter. So before we do that, I wanted to get into some recommendations and tools. So getting to know the student or the student employee the best way you can in whatever context you're in. So my recommendations for this are asking the use of surnames and pronouns. So, you may not know the student super well. So asking them, hey, like what pronoun do you prefer I use if I need to use it in this letter? Do you have a certain surname you prefer me to use? The student may be married, you may not know. So always recommend that. And then there's a super cool tool. It's called the Gender Bias Calculator. So if you follow this link, you can actually copy and paste your entire recommendation letter, and the software will say these are all your feminine words and these are all your masculine words. So it'll kind of do the work for you in a sense. And it's just really interesting to see what the software picks up in terms of masculine versus feminine words and identifiers. And okay, so moving on to some best practices for writers. So the first thing I want to say is we know that this probably isn't your first priority. Writing recommendation letters is something that's kind of those other duties as assigned. We know we're all super busy with our day-to-day responsibilities, but for a student, this could really be the make or break piece of their materials and the interview process. So especially if they're applying for a really competitive spot in a fellowship, a graduate program, a job position. So remember how important this is for a student and how much trust they're putting in you to write this letter for them. So going back to the activity that we just did, if you write your whole reference letter and you remove the name and the pronouns, would the reader be able to know the gender? And I say this in terms of any unconscious biases that may be present in the letter that we all do every now and then. So traditionally, like Brenna mentioned, men are talked about in terms of their skills and potential, and women are talked about in terms of their looks or personality. So she's so caring, she's so warm, she's so sweet, versus she is a skilled in XYZ, she has potential for leadership, whatever it is. Something else is never to out someone's ability, sexual orientation, or personal info. So an example here would be, even though they have a speech impediment, they're still a great student employee. So, obviously that's inappropriate to mention, and the student may not want that to be shared with people that are outside their immediate circle. So just be really conscious when you're writing never to give away any super personal information, even if you're using it as a veiled praise or qualifier. So know that students may not know what to provide for you to be a reference. So let them know what you need from them. I have so many students who come to the Career Center who are applying for grad school or a fellowship or whatever it may be, saying, what do I give my reference letter writers? I don't know what to include. So the ideal situation for a letter, in my opinion, is for the student to provide the resume, the job description, the program description, and whatever other materials you may need to write the strongest letter. I had one student one time give me literally an entire mini binder of all of her materials. It was the resumes, the descriptions, transcripts, like everything I could ever want to know about this student. And that was obviously a little out of the norm, and I really appreciated it. But just communicate with the student what you need from them for you to be able to write the best letter. So, a few other best practices, going back to what Brenna was saying about power. So, consider the inherent power dynamic in play in this scenario and how that will affect the situation. Even if you and the student have an amazing relationship, maybe you're close, the student has been in classes with you or they work for you, this is a different scenario. So, the student may be a little more timid when asking, or they may not feel comfortable with something you put in a letter, but may not feel comfortable expressing that to you. So even though, you still have the same relationship and you're still, student, faculty, student, supervisor, this is a different situation at play and a different power dynamic. Also, keep in mind the student may never see the letter. The student is giving up a sense of control in the situation. So, if you were the student reading the letter, would you be comfortable with what was written? Putting yourself in the student's shoes to see, what would they think about this? And if you truly don't have the time to write an exceptional letter for the student, that's perfectly okay. Just politely decline. With anybody, it's never good to string people along, not respond or commit to writing the letter, and then miss the deadline. So if it's uncomfortable for the student to keep following up because of the power dynamic and you are essentially doing them a favor, they don't want to bug you, etc. So if you feel that you cannot commit to writing a letter for someone, just politely decline. And then if you end up not writing one, offer to help them brainstorm. So say, I'm unable to commit to this right now, but I'd love to chat with you about, who else could be a potential reference letter writer for you at this time. So I wanted to briefly mention some legal and policy information in terms of FERPA. So this is pulled straight from the JMU registrar's website in terms of recommendation letters. So written permission of the student is required for a letter of recommendation if any information included in the letter is part of the educational record. So grades, GPA, anything that's part of their record in terms of a student. So if you do want to include something like that in the letter, referencing a grade they got in your class or whatever it may be, technically you do need written permission from the student to comply with FERPA. So just wanted to put that out there. So now we are going to move on to our case studies. So I'm really excited about these to see what you all think about these scenarios. So the first case study is you receive a request from a former student and TA, Sally, to write a letter of recommendation for an internship that she is applying for. She was an exceptional student and employee, and you'd be more than happy to recommend her for the next step in her career. Once you receive her resume and the internship posting, you realize the organization is a politically affiliated company that does not align with your personal values. Even though Sally is a great candidate for any internship, you don't know if you feel comfortable writing a letter to recommend her to work for a company when its practices and mission differ so heavily from what you stand for. What do you do? So, big question. Feel free to put your thoughts in the chat or unmute yourself. I'd love to hear what people's thoughts are in this, or if you've been in this situation before.
And as people are thinking, I've had more time to think about this case study, but I think that it does highlight for me just how, in the beginning we were talking about suddenly we're in this role as letter or recommendation writers. And for most of us, we just have to kind of Google answers. We don't have any sort of formal training. And so the issues of writing letters of recommendation aren't black and white. Scenarios come up that are tricky that you wouldn't even think so, like, oh, I'm just writing a letter for a student. But, I think this case study in particular kind of shows how complicated the situation would be, or maybe for someone is uncomplicated, thinking, it shouldn't matter what they're applying to. Just really interesting.
I would most likely write the recommendation where Sally works as her choice. If the org did work that I consider unethical, I would tell Sally I couldn't write the rec and I would tell her why. She can always get another recommendation. Okay. So I got a direct message that says, if I felt I could not write a strong letter, I would need to let the student know as soon as possible so they could find another reference. So far, I have not had this happen, but I've had to pass and write a letter if I cannot write a strong one. Okay. Okay. He says, I've been in similar situations and ultimately asked myself what I'd do for any requested is, can I speak about their qualifications for this opportunity? Do so to research the company myself. Okay. So a few people are saying that they would put their beliefs to the side, write the letter, it's about the student. And then some people are saying this might be a situation where I politely decline, brainstorm who could be a different writer for them. Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a tricky situation. I haven't really thought about what I would do if this was in my shoes. It would definitely have to think about it for sure. Yeah, brainstorming a different writer suggestion. Awesome. So, right now there's never a, correct, right, or wrong answer, but I just encourage you all to think about this, especially if this ever did come up in a situation for you, and what your course of action would be. So we can go to case study 2. So you receive an email from a company saying that your current student, Joe, listed you as a reference for a full-time position, and please send them a letter as soon as possible for Joe to be considered further. Joe has never spoken with you about this position, and you didn't even know he was job searching. You don't know much about the company or about Joe's educational and work history. You and Joe have a good rapport in class. You consider him a great student, but this request has left you a little blindsided. You're having a lighter semester and technically have the time to write the letter. That afternoon, Joe approaches you after class and says, thanks so much in advance for being a reference for me. I hope it's okay. I listed you. I have to head to my next class, but I'll see you soon. What do you do? So this one might be a little bit more common for folks, getting the old, didn't know I was a reference, but now I am situation. So yeah, feel free to put in the chat. What would you do? Thoughts you have, ways to move forward. This happens more than I would like it to. Yes, absolutely. And keep in mind that every student that I come in contact with at the Career Center and every workshop I do, I always say, ask your references ahead of time. So I'm doing the little part that I can. Joe and I would definitely need to have a conversation. Yes, exactly. Need to meet with me to get more information. Yep, for sure. I think this might be a situation where, going back to the best practices bullet point, where the student just may be uninformed about what the proper process is for asking for a reference. He may just be thinking, oh, like so and so knows me, I'm in class with them, they can speak on my behalf. So this might be an educational moment for Joe, to just you have a conversation with him and say, hey, let's talk about like the actual process of getting like a reference for someone, the information that I need, the timeline, etc. This happens often. Schedule meetings we can talk through, give feedback on professionalism. Yep. If there's anything that would put me in a bad mood when writing, that probably opens the door to writing with veiled praise and should be approached with caution. Absolutely. So, if you're in a tricky situation with a student, maybe you're feeling some type of way that might lead you to some unconscious bias or resentment in your letter. So, definitely something to be aware of. Absolutely, Lindsay. Good stuff. Perfect. Well, again, with this, there is no right or wrong answer right now. We just wanted you to have it in your mind for when and if this does happen to you in the future. So this is our works cited page that we pulled some of our research from. So again, if you have any questions or want to research further about anything that we talked about today, I encourage you to just follow these links, take a picture of it if you want to investigate further. And then I think Brenna's going to put the link to the calculator in the chat soon. So that's all the content that we have for today for you, but we want to open it up for any discussions, questions, comments, anything people would like to share.